Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Seriously Curious, a podcast all things UX for business strategy and design. I'm Chris Rockwell. I'm founder and president of Lextant. For 25 years, we've been putting people at the center of design, of product and services experience, and I'm super excited today to have with me Jon Walter, Director of UX for Rockwell Automation. Jon is head of UX for controls and software, and he's leading a team of UXers, researchers, strategists, and designers on the design of next generation automation for manufacturing systems. And I think today is a unique opportunity for us to learn about what's unique about application of UX in B2B environments. And so, Jon, I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us.
Of course. Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So to start off with, Jon, maybe we can talk a little bit about how you landed in this unique position of head of UX for Rockwell Automation.
Yeah, I'm never ceases to amaze me how people find themselves into this space. In my case, I started off as a graphic designer. So I went to University of Dayton. My degree was visual communication design, VCD. Yeah. And I started off kind of doing small startup world. Like I was in a small security firm starting out. I went from there to a couple of other places, but I ended up at Progressive Insurance. And there I took on a hybrid role. Like I design was always kind of part of what I did, but one thing that I was passionate about was development as well. Kind of like seeing the product get into development, see it in production. Right. And I took on a role at Progressive Insurance for a while as a front-end dev, but all along UX was a part of it too. Like I kind of had a hybrid role. I was a UX architect in my own mind. I kind of gave myself that title. Sure. But I did a lot of wireframing. And when I was at Progressive, we're in a unique position to, back when responsive design was all the craze. Ethan Marcotte's book came out, Luke Wroblewski's Mobile First came out, and I was fortunate enough to have a manager who gave me the opportunity to start to wireframe out what this would look like, not just thinking about from a development standpoint, but from a information architecture, navigation standpoint, and it kind of whetted the appetite again for design. Obviously, UI design, visual design has always been a part of it, but the UX design, taking things into usability, seeing things where it succeeded and failed, I'm like, I think I want to get back in this full time again. Yeah. So then, lo and behold, there was a role that opened up at Rockwell Automation, a company I knew nothing about. Yeah. And they were hiring for a UX architect. And I'm like, that sounds fascinating, especially after reading the job description. Yeah. And it sounds like a very complex space. I knew very little about it, and I'd never really done the B2B thing at this scale before. Yeah. So fortunately, I was able to apply and get it. And throughout my career at Rockwell, I started off as a UX architect, as the job was, a number of different applications. Rockwell is one of these companies where the average person is not going to know everything what we do, but a lot of people who are controls engineers, people who do, they work on the plant floor context, they're going to know about our software. Yeah. Things like Studio 5000, Logix Designer, which are our flagship products. But then, like everybody else, Rockwell started getting into the game of SaaS-based software, cloud-based software. So I worked on a number of different products. One was called Factory Talk Analytics for Devices. One was called Logix AI, one of our first forays into AI and machine learning. And then over time, I found myself in the leadership positions. I became a team lead in 2019. And soon after that, followed manager, and then where I'm at today in a director. So today, I'm over Rockwell Automation, Software and Control Business Unit, a UX team. We're about 50 strong, and we're across the globe. Okay. Before we jump more into the Rockwell Automation kind of work, which I think is fascinating and completely different than many UXers and CXers are working in a more B2C space. Tell me a little bit about the UX Matters work. So you're an author and frequent publisher for UX Matters. Some of your work has been really interesting on inclusive design and communities, and tell me, just tell us a little bit about that. Yeah, well, I appreciate it, and thank you for bringing that up. That is a passion of my writing and I talked about even before this talk, just what got me writing to begin with. And I can recall back in 2015, 2016, I was just looking for best practice tips, like in the B2B space, and trying to understand what are some people doing. And every article I came across was about a social media app or a dating app or financial services, banking. Nobody talked about what I kind of consider the silent generation of users, not just the B2B, but people who are in these industrial environments in manufacturing. We never talk about them. And you could make the same kind of claim within healthcare and some of those enterprise level software solutions. And I'm like, you know what? No one's writing about them. Maybe I should. And that was after I read a book called Code of the Extraordinary Mind. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Vishen Lakhani. He kind of like, after reading that book, because I was always nervous to write, I was terrified of it.
Yeah.
But he flipped the narrative for me, kind of saying, well, why would I do that? Why wouldn't I do it? Why not? Why just give it a shot and see how it goes. So I started off writing Medium articles, and then eventually worked up the courage to submit some articles at UX Matters.
Okay.
And fortunate enough, their editor-in-chief, Pavani, she's been great. She's been a staple in the UX community for a long time. She got to the point of like, why don't you write a recurring column? So I still write today, not as frequently as I did before, but I still write.
Excellent. Yeah, I think sometimes we get stuck in this idea, well, like nothing I have to say is important or whatever, but I always encourage my team too to like get your thoughts out there, because that's the way we learn from each other. And so we'll talk about some of those topics that you've been focused on in our conversation today, but let's talk maybe just a little bit about what's unique about practicing UX in an enterprise environment. First of all, I don't think it's hard to wrap your mind around the scale and scope of the solutions that you're designing. So maybe just tell us, like, what's the application of your team's work?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that's unique, getting back to your original question about the B2B space, and this is something it took me time to get my arms around, was just the fact that the customer and user are not the same. In fact, they could be vastly different. Yeah. Back when I was in the B2C space, it was easy. People buy your product and boom, they're up and running it as a user. And the customer, the user threshold is it's basically not even a thing. But in the B2B space, it's very different. The timing's different. The amount of time it takes somebody to purchase something before they start using it. In the past, it's changing now. We're talking months, if not even years, to spin up a project or some kind of solution for a customer. So I think that there's the timing of it, there's the fact that the customers and users are vastly different, and just the industrial automation space, to your point, it's massive.
Yeah.
It can scale from a site level to like a couple, like imagine being in Columbus, we could have one plant here, but if it's a big enough customer, we could be in multiple plants across the globe, and it becomes an enterprise level solution, and then you have a whole other account, you have a whole other. In some cases, you're designing solutions just for a specific customer. They're that big. So
you were telling me earlier, like almost anything you can imagine, any product manufactured, any like wastewater treatment plant, or it's all impacted by Rockwell Automation Solutions. So it's really everything, the manufacturing floor and up, you said. Tell me about that.
We do. We are a full solution operation. When you think of kind of what we talked about earlier, like you think of it almost like that Purdue model, the operation technology level, we have solutions that our design and control solutions are very much embedded there, where you're designing software to be run and deployed on PLCs, product line controllers.
Okay.
Yeah. Product line controllers, where you could be managing a bottling line, or you could be managing like a diaper line.
Right.
Those are the type of things those software solutions do. But then you kind of click up a couple levels, and we talk about our edge products, which are deployed at the edge to help connect the IT, the OT level, so operation technology, the information technology.
Okay.
Most people are going to be familiar with the kind of the above the line IT stuff, but again, Rockwell's got to be able to connect, and nobody does it better than a lot of the companies like Rockwell, where a lot of these products are ours that we own. Our Allen Bradley product line, our hardware, our software is tailor-made for it. And so we have a lot of edge products that are kind of in that middle zone. Then when you kind of click up a couple layers, we have our maintenance solutions, fixed software. We have Plex Systems, which is our operations technology, MES software. Okay. And we have a lot of things that are kind of in those areas as well. So basically the whole stack is
so your user base is so vast. You mentioned just like decision makers versus end users, but you have like plant managers, maintenance supervisors, manufacturing line workers. I mean, the number of users and the workflows involved are incredibly vast and complex. And as you mentioned, that these could be like $1 million to $1 billion kinds of solutions, right? You're going to stand up a manufacturing plant. I mean, that must be really hard to wrap your head around. And like, how do you begin to understand all of those users and the workflows required in order to design solutions that are effective for them.
I still don't understand it all, to be honest. And honest, I've been at Rockwell for over 12 years now, and I still feel like a baby.
Right.
We have people who've been there for decades, and it honestly, it takes a good deal of time to really get a sense for the overall space. Even just something that's a specific domain, whether it's visualization, that's a whole other area, whether it's asset management, whether it's design and control, which we talked about. Those areas alone take a good deal of domain knowledge and humbleness too, just to be able to absorb the space, kind of, as we talked about earlier, that apprentice mindset. Like where I'm talking to somebody who is kind of like the master of what they do, and there are users, controls engineers, and really trying to understand how they do their work.
Yeah, so it's almost, there's, sometimes we talk about bad UX practices like next bench thinking. Well, I would want it like this. Yeah. You can't do that in your space at all. So how do you sort of partner with your end users or stakeholders to really understand what problems to solve and how solutions need to work? Tell me what makes that kind of unique in your work.
Yeah, it's first of all, overcoming the temptation to design for yourself is big time. You cannot do that. You have to be able to get into their mind space, understand what the problems they're trying to solve. A lot of it we have a very strong group of internal SMEs at Rockwell across the board. A lot of our top product managers, top engineers, top architects used to be in the field themselves. So I think we do need to rely on their internal knowledge quite a bit, but it's also leveraging them and leveraging their expertise and relationships to get connected to people in the field, to actual customers, and better yet, the users. And that is where it's kind of the holy grail, is getting access to that level, to the actual users themselves. Right. Getting past the customers. And that takes relationship building. It takes a good level. And, I think a topic we'll probably touch on is understanding the business and understanding, the customers themselves and what we're trying to solve for them. Yeah. But I think that is where we do ourselves a service, to be honest, by having that level of curiosity and communication to really just ask the questions, how can I get access to the actual end users? Because as I learned in the B2C space, we at Progressive, we had a lab. Right. Everybody has insurance. It's state mandated. It's easy. You're tripping over users. But in our space, in the B2B industrial automation, it's way more elusive. And I can touch on it, later on about what you have to go through. But I think it's really committing to it and really advocating for getting access to them.
Well, let's take something simple like evaluating a concept or a solution. In a B2C space, you might do that in a lab, but you can't really replicate that same kind of idea in a big manufacturing context. So maybe walk us through, like, how would you evaluate a design decision when you have to get access to sort of fairly complicated user set, maybe in a complicated context?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is getting access to where they're at. It's not enough, like, there's obviously the very controlled being in a lab or something. That's just not the way it goes. I've been to like a tobacco company where the lighting was horrible. It was amazing to me just how a solution you expect to look a certain way, to behave a certain way. I'm like, oh, it's all, it's kind of like the whole Mike Tyson quote, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. It's kind of like your software is going to get punched in the face in these environments, and it's going to be unpredictable. And I think the biggest thing is getting access to the users where they're at. And you can't replicate it unless you do it. And I think a lot of it could be, it is a budget concern. You've got to find ways you got to get the travel approved. You got to be able to get there. NDAs need to be signed. You've got to wear the personal protective equipment, and just it's a whole different ballgame than what you would see in other industries, especially B2C. So I would certainly advocate for anybody who does the type of work we do, is do everything you can to get access to the users, because they will surprise you. There's a solution you may have thought that we nailed it. We got it completely, the way we think it needs to be. The workflows are efficient, but they will shock you in the field, the way they use things or circumvent things that you thought would work for them. Right. So that adage, I mean, you're dealing with expert users too, which I think is unique in a lot of ways. Like, you can't design a black box, right? They need to understand how it works, what's happening in order for them to control it. So you mentioned access to the context and to the individual.
But then there's also understanding kind of the mindset under which they operate, understanding the shortcuts and things that accelerate their work practice and things like that. Do these remote tools that we're using now to do research, UX research, for example, have those been beneficial at sort of reaching out and getting better access to customers, or does it really require you to always be in context, or is it some combination?
It's some combination. I don't think it's possible to get access to every user in every case. I wish we could. But at the same time, we're realistic, and technology's gotten to a place to where it has enabled us. Tools like Rally, like Dovetail, like Maze, our UX research team leverages those to, and honestly, make sure we're not soliciting the same customer twice, or at least we're spacing things out. And it helps us also get organized around segmenting certain customers. We have OEMs, we have system integrators, we have end users, but inside of that, we have other personas such as. You got the plant managers, controls engineers, maintenance technicians, people who are more operations focused. So you've got to be hyper organized. It's not just, it's not somebody who's in the B2C space where the persona is pretty well known and pretty, broad. These are very highly specific, highly specialized roles. And you touched on people who are experts too. And we've got to consider them as well, like people who are the expert type level user, very experienced versus who's novice, less experienced. And those are the type of things we got to make sure our solutions satisfy both.
You mentioned in one of your UX Matters articles about communities of practice.
Yeah.
And do your communities of practice kind of help you create this institutional knowledge of who you're designing for and the complex workflow you're supporting and stuff? Tell me about communities of practice.
Yeah, I think not only does it help us with our internal practice, like internal sharing, making sure that we're, as a team, we're upskilling and we're staying, where we need to be with our domain knowledge. But it also has provided a nice forum for us to bring in kind of our own SMEs to, people throughout the company to help us upskill our knowledge. And I think that's really helped because we have a lot of people inside Rockwell, and I know a lot of other big businesses probably are similar, where you've got a good deal of people who have a lot of experience, and it helps really grow that overall knowledge and awareness. So communities of practice have been very valuable. We have them a couple times a month, and I think they're some of the best forums for even people who aren't in a UX kind of quote unquote proper function, like that's what they do. They could be in an adjacent role. They attend them as well, and it provides kind of a nice learning opportunity for many people.
So the communities of practice basically allow you to share knowledge, and so you can transfer knowledge amongst the team members quickly and get get aligned on who you're designing for. Or you even mentioned earlier that sometimes these meetings are about conference share outs or tool share outs or other kind of things, so they can be used in a really flexible way.
So disseminating knowledge is one of the number one things we use them for, and it's certainly been a good conduit for best practices. And How do you ultimately measure the success of your team? I imagine it's daunting to try to design for such a complex ecosystem, but like ultimately, how do you measure the effectiveness of your team, or what do you look for success measures? That's a great question. So first of all, I look to make sure that we are helping these products get out in production. We're hitting our dates. We all know that we're part of a bigger ecosystem. We're part of bigger teams. We have to get things out on time. We have to, we try to stay a certain cadence ahead from a sprint schedule to make sure we're delivering our design artifacts. I find it to be a huge success when we're able to see. One example is if we go to, let's say, one of our trade shows and we test one of our products, we identify, let's say, 10 anomalies. Through usability testing, validation, we know that there's 10 areas where people are tripping over the carpet. How quickly do we get that into a team's Jira backlog? And how quickly do our engineering team get in that production? And how quickly can we then do a comparative analysis to see, here's how long time on task took before, here's what's happening after. That's a huge success to me. And that's something we can measure. Other things, very practically, and I'd encourage other UX teams to do this as well, is just think about verbatims, like customer quotes, like what are they saying? Those are powerful to the business, as well as internal stakeholders too. What are they saying about our team? So-and-so did incredibly valuable work. They helped me do X, Y, and Z. That's stuff I can take as a leader and I can tell my leadership team, I'm like, hey, look what, and at the end of the day, we all have we all have customers, and we all have other people we're trying to prove ourselves to, and often like getting the kind of that affirmation from senior leadership that hey, they recognize what our team's doing is a big deal.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes, I found when I was at Hewlett Packard, we were working on, not quite at the scale that Rockwell Automation is at, but we were working on global enterprise software management, for systems administrators and the like. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that we found is if you could just show kind of small wins at the grassroots level and then tell those stories to the organization, you could get more traction for the kind of work, more buy-in to what you're doing. And ultimately, I found the organization would come to us for knowledge of the customer, like, hey, what would this customer need or this end user need? So you build good, strong relationships with R&D and marketing and sales team, because you become kind of that owner or advocate for the customer and the experiences they're having and they want to have. So I think that there's ways that when you have such a large system that you're supporting, getting those kind of wins. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you're coming up with grassroots. I think that's something that we can't be everywhere. You can't eat the whole elephant, especially in our space. But where can you find? Where is that kind of point of access where you've got a very collaborative product manager? You've got a very real problem that needs to be solved, and how can you take that as an opportunity to keep it pretty well confined to small enough to manage, and then treat it as that grassroots win, case study, and then you build on that, and other people see it, and it provides more credence of what UX brings.
Right. So we talked about that kind of bottom up evidence, but what about top down support? How does that work in your practice?
Top down can be very challenging. We've got really good, strong senior leadership at Rockwell, but they've got their mind on so many other things. They've got to be thinking across the board. As I mentioned, software and control, I mentioned earlier, is a $2.2 billion business, a massive portfolio. And they got to be thinking about a number of things. And the way UX manifests in it is going to be something that, if it just works, it works. It's one of those things.
Right.
So I think the biggest thing you can do is continue to build champions throughout the business. Build allies in the product side of things, engineering, architecture, PMO, wherever you can build allies, and relationships go a long way. And you may not get an audience with the senior leadership, but they might. Right. And if you're doing successful things there, your name may be dropped in certain areas, and hopefully it's in the positive light. And that's where I think you can start to get that awareness. And then ideally, we have our all hands meetings. We just had one this morning in software and control, and if you can get a presence in those meetings to kind of not just show off what you do. What I don't like to do is celebrate the otherness of UX. Hey, this is what UX does. I like to show how we've contributed and partnered with the program and how we were woven into that, to their success. If you can do that, to me, that's the holy grail right there, is to really show others. And then they think of UX as not just this otherness, this ivory tower. They think of it as a partner that's kind of got skin in the game.
Let's talk about that. You mentioned this idea of upskilling. Your communities of practice kind of are about cross-pollination as well. So tell me a little bit about, because you've mentioned it several times, the importance of UXers like getting out of their own their headspace and really connecting with others in the organization and building empathy and eyes on the larger business. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing, and if I could give anybody advice, is just to have, whether you're coming into the profession or you've been in it for a while, is just to give grace to the bit. They may not always understand what you do. Right. And use it as an advantage. Don't think of it as a disadvantage. And I wouldn't take it personally if they say, "Oh, you're the VOC team," or "Oh, you're going to do a CAB or a customer advisory board for us," or they might think that you do competitive analysis. Be like, think of it more of a yes and. Especially if it's a real business. If they need something and they don't really know how to do it, why can't you maybe take as a UX designer, you naturally have a certain amount of empathy and user-centered mindset. Why not? Why couldn't you use that to, maybe I'm going to try to understand how our competitor does something, or how users think of our competitors, or maybe like what are some things around market insights that I could help them uncover, even though that's not really my job. I think I'll tell you what doesn't go well is when we think that that's not my job. I think you do best is if you can, okay, I'm going to wear this hat for a little bit, just temporarily, but then as I go, I'm going to shoehorn in what I actually do well. Yeah. And so some things I try to get people to think of, and I try not to think of it as nefariously, but think of yourself as like a double agent. Like you could be, you're going to pretend to be in this different role for all, you do your best in it. Acknowledge that they may not know what you do, right. But then as you go, okay, I can start thinking of the things I would normally think as a UX professional and start to onboard their knowledge as we go. Okay. And I think the number one thing I would stay away from is the words. I have nothing but respect for some of the thought leaders out in the UX space, but when you hear words like cognitive walkthrough, heuristic evaluation, don't use those words with stakeholders. It's not going to work. Yeah. So you can use them amongst yourself in your community practice, but think of what it means to them.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot to this building advocacy and empathy for the others that you're working with. I've always thought like my job is to make you successful. It's like my job is not to make me successful. Yes. It's to make whoever I'm serving as part of the business successful, and our of course end user and end customers. But the more I can understand their job, what matters to them, and connect with them, I can be way more effective. It's kind of like a servant leadership kind of mindset too. I think
it is.
And I like your idea of like you have to take things like that's not my job like out of your vocabulary. Mm-hmm. Like you have to. I love the idea of yes and. It's like, of course, let's figure out how to do this together. Mm-hmm. And in that, you find out how to share your unique skill set, how to really understand what other people need, and help the business ultimately succeed, that's our job, right? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I really like that idea of upskilling. I think it's something that I encourage all young people coming into the industry. Mm. It's like, learn as much as you can about the others that you are working with and where your work goes downstream and who's upstream of your work, so that you can really understand how to help everybody.
Completely agree, and it'll only serve you better as a UX practitioner too.
For sure, yeah. So I like some of these practical tips about, I like your communities of practice idea and the idea of saying yes. When people need something, say yes. I've had people approach me for what maybe looks more like market research or other kinds of things, and so you're like, sure, let me see how I can help you with that. Because we do have unique skills from that standpoint.
One thing I'll tack on to it, just to put a finer point on it too, is where there's chaos, there's opportunity. And if somebody's coming to you, especially if somebody's as a senior leader or somebody who's got a real problem, they're coming to you for a reason, right? And lean into the chaos, because there's a lot of people who will say no to that or shy away from it, but that'll be remembered, especially if you're able to help them get through it. And again, it does nothing but benefit you as a UX practitioner.
I think that's a leadership skill too. Yeah. I always think that UX folks and design folks have a unique opportunity to lead organizations because we know how to facilitate group discussion, we know how to clarify problems to solve or opportunities. And we know how to envision the future. And if we can do those things, you can plant us almost anywhere in the organization and we can add value. So look for the opportunity to add value. And that ultimately will build more opportunity, I think. And leadership results in more leadership. I find that small organizations that do that become big organizations. Like small UX teams become bigger UX teams. Yep. Because it shows how you can think beyond your specific fence.
Very true.
Yeah. One of the things that you were talking about, we were talking about the things that make your practice unique. One of those being you have massively more users, you have more specialized users, and so the importance of building knowledge and being able to sort of focus on the context of use and the specific goals. But you mentioned before, I saw in UX Matters some of your work on inclusive design, for example. That's also a unique aspect of your practice in a B2B context. So tell me about inclusive design.
Yeah, I know inclusive design and accessibility, these are topics that have been out there quite a bit, but when you think of it in our space, it becomes interesting when you think of the fact that customers will kind of bring certain things to the job. PPE is one of them, personal protective equipment. And you have to think of, okay, this terminal, this panel that they're going to be interacting with, they may be wearing gloves. So what are the hit zones going to be like with the capacitive touch? Are they going to be able to have the same impact as if they would just with their bare fingers? Right. That we have a industrial design team, they have to think about the size of the human hand, and can you hit certain things with our equipment? Be able to, whether it's a certain button, or can you? We have LED lights. Are they clear? Are they discernible? We know that red-green color blindness is very common, and especially when you get into some of these environments, you can't assume that people are going to, when you just only color key things, you can't assume that that's going to be enough. Yeah. So within our software solutions, we have to also be like, okay, how do we redundantly code this to make sure that it's visible and we're not just relying on color alone? And then there's also something you and I talked about earlier, the localization side of things, where we are a global company and we can't just assume that red means the same thing for everybody. Just like other colors and other idioms we may even use with our language. And that's another thing that, to me, part of design is also the language we use. We have to keep it very straightforward. So inclusive design, it's a lot. It bleeds into accessibility, but it's also something that we're really starting to, I think, quantify a lot more in what we're doing within Rockwell Automation and other companies like us. And I think when you think of the industrial space, it's very easy to have visibility problems and some other issues that you're not really disabled in many ways, but in some ways it's imposed upon you.
Yeah. So when you say quantification, you mean by way of specification or measurement, or what do you mean by quantification?
Well, I think we look at things like WCAG, AA, AAA compliance in terms of color contrast ratio. And I think quantifiable, you could argue with, we talked about power users earlier, a lot of our design applications. Now these are less plant floor specific or plant floor centric, but you've got to be able to reward your power users too. This is more of an accessibility accelerator type thing, where how many keystrokes did it take to tab over to that area within the interface, and how long did that take them? And those types of things we are able to measure and quantify too.
We have more of an aging population too, right? Is that impacting your work?
Yes.
Or how is manufacturing changing in terms of the kind of demographic and psychographic that are in plant operations? And I mean, then you have the other influence of automation that's in your title of your company, right? So like, how does automation impacting all of that from a sort of inclusive design standpoint?
Well, first of all, we do have an aging work population, especially in our space. There's been acknowledged for a while that there's brain drain happening. There's a lot of very experienced workers in every context that they're retiring. They're getting to retirement age, and the latest workforce, are they ready to take on these type of work roles and assignments? And Rockwell, we've been coming up with solutions. One's called Connect Worker, and it's a thing where we help with the process steps for basically users who they may not be experts yet, but they're getting guided work instructions where and it kind of dovetails into AI, where AI is able to kind of smartly assist them along the way. But at the same time, I talked about earlier, it's even though the word automation is there, it's still way more human facing than you might think, the whole industry. And you're not going to get away from designing for humans. And that's going to be an aspect for it. Even if they are novice users, we still need them in these contexts.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I really like that from one of your UX Matters articles. Industrial automation is more human facing than you might think. It is what we're talking about here. Like, we still need humans in the loop to help configure and specify and assure that the processes are working the way they're supposed to, the information is correct. Like, how do humans fit into this increasingly automated ecosystem that you're part of?
I think it's starting to look different than it did before. I think obviously you needed in the past on the plant floor, whether it's overseeing a bottling line or some other line, you're going to have a human there. You're going to see probably less menial tasks being overseen by humans. You're going to see more quality control, and those types of things have been automated through AI and those types of technologies, but you still need humans to help interpret what's happening, obviously be there in case something doesn't go the way you expect. And I think we're going to start seeing, and when people say this, I still struggle to think of like kind of project what it's going to look like, but there's a lot of people who say there's a lot of jobs that haven't been invented yet because of the whole AI boom happening. And I do imagine there is going to be a lot more roles around training these systems, interpreting these systems, coming up with different ways of leveraging them that are going to require humans. And the good news is I think we're going to become more strategic, and I think we're going to be less doing the type of tasks that could be, obviously offloaded by a different type of technology. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's the same thing.
Human machine teaming, right? I mean, the machines need to understand how experts do the work, so they need to be trained in how to do the work. And so I agree. I think our role changes. Non-value add work maybe can be taken over through increasing automation, but the role of the human is always going to be critical as a collaborator. I still see automation and AI as being sort of an accelerant, a collaborator. And I think that's the mindset we have to have moving forward, especially, in the space that you're working in. There's no shortage of things that need to get done. So there are going to be important roles, high value add roles for people. Yeah, for sure. So going on to, you mentioned in one of my earlier calls that we had together, this idea of CX versus UX.
Yes.
We've had this conversation in other podcasts, and there's this increasing focus on customer centricity, which is amazing and great.
Yeah.
I mean, organizations are getting it, but it's also created some challenges too. So tell me about this sort of, what you mentioned was a CX UX chasm. What do you think is happening there?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to we're different, but I think a lot of people conflate the two. And the chasm is with customer experience, you're thinking more longer term touch points. You're thinking, and there's also the brand part of it too, kind of brand relationship, brand perception. When you think of UX, like the way I think of it and the way I think a lot of my team thinks of it too, is like when we think of our UX design team, we are very product focused. Or product service focused, or maybe a system, but it's more of a confined part of what we're working on. And we think in terms of sprints. We think in terms of those cycles, getting things out in the production, working with product management teams. And when you think of CX, you're talking about touch points, you're talking about customer satisfaction, you're talking about other metrics that could be different. And I think the chasm gets into the vocabulary. I think we talk about things, and we may use some words that sound similar, but they're vastly different in many ways too. And I think there is a bit of a conflation between the two, and people have confused my team with customer experience and vice versa. But I think both are necessary. And one topic that you'll see next week on UX Matters, it's coming out with my co-writer Magda, is we're talking about how these teams can start sealing that, bringing that chasm, less so a chasm, more of a bridge, and how we can start to put together certain activities, rituals, processes to start working together. And then, and we talk about some very practical misses where, hypothetical use cases where this team could have done something better if they were aware of what the other team was doing. And maybe the wrong thing happened, or something got out in the production too quickly, and we weren't thinking about the customer journey overall. So I think it's a vocabulary thing. I think it's a timing thing. I think it's also just the way the work is done type thing.
Yeah, I like the sort of macro versus micro distinction. I think can help. And the relational versus interaction, I think in one of your earlier UX Matter articles was good. And I'm looking forward to seeing the one coming out. I think I distinctly remember when CX went from being like the call center to doing personas and customer journey maps. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Then the challenge became, well, how do we translate what's happening at the CX level to product and service design at the UX level? And how are the things that we're doing at the UX level impacting measurables at the CX level? So there's still a need to connect them together. And it's like you say, it's not bad. We need them both. We need all levels of customer focus. I think the question is, how do we create clarity around who's specifying what the field and the goalposts look like
Yeah.
and how we deliver on it.
Yeah.
Do you think your communities of practice, I mean, is that something, is that an opportunity to bring CX and UX together? Or
It is, yeah. But I think we need to go beyond that, and we have a little bit. So yes, sharing spaces, that is, to me, table stakes. You got to be sharing spaces. You got to be sharing, like, whether it's a recurring monthly meeting or bi-monthly meeting where, again, you're kind of exchanging best practices. CX should be there as one of your kind of trusted presenters. But I think it's also, we just had a project that happened a couple of years ago where we needed to design something that was net new. And it was a product that we've never had before. And what we ended up doing was we're like, you know what, this is a good opportunity to engage the CX team from an overall customer journey, because these were things that buying a product in a single SKU that involved hardware, it involved software, and it was something a distributor could sell too. And it also was something that could be easily deployed and into a user's hands very quickly, very easy to stand up. And we worked with our CX team to kind of help us work through that overall journey. And when one way that I kind of think of the relationship is through the deliverable we created. We created a journey map where our CX team kind of helped us map out kind of the more zoomed out what this whole overall thing looks like when somebody's considering, they're deciding to buy, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And the UX team and my UX researchers also helped with this, was providing those zoomed in moments. Like you're zooming into, okay, so you're now at this buy and use phase. What's that look like in the product?
Right.
When I buy this product and I'm starting to use it and I'm on board, that's another one, was on board phase. There's a very common out-of-box experience that needs to happen. Then you're into the UX before you know it. So that's one area where I think is very interesting when it comes to SaaS products, is you go from being a customer or prospective customer to a user in like no time flat.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing that in industrial automation, believe it or not. It's starting to get there. And some of these products we're starting to design, we're starting to have those conversations. So it's happening. I think it's just, we got to get a little more rigor around it, just overall in all of our spaces, in B2B in general. So that's one thing I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think in some ways this is similar with marketing, because there's overlap. It's not bad that there's overlap between the kind of things that we're doing. In fact, CX has to take the calls and service the accounts that are maybe trying to get the most out of the software that we're making, right? So they own aspects of the experience, moments of the experience. Nobody owns every moment of the experience. And so how do we increase our collaboration there, knowing that we all share the same goal, which is how do you create a great experience?
It's got to be very intentional. And one thing I am toying with, and I'm still deciding if I'm going to do this, but how can you share certain objectives or goals throughout the year? Can you put something in writing to where you are guaranteeing you're working together? It's got to matter. It can't be arbitrary. But how can you put something on paper so we're all accountable for it? We know it's going to get done.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about measurement for a minute. So when we think about, often CX is responsible for voice of the customer or satisfaction surveys, or we think there's opportunities to build experience metrics that are based on customer value drivers and connect those to business KPIs. So there's a lot of measurement that happens at the enterprise level. How does that similar or different than the kind of experience measurement that you use in the development of products and services?
Yeah, so when I think of, that's where things get a little fuzzy, and I'll admit it can be tricky to really get a sense for where we fit in with customer satisfaction surveys and the type of thing that, as a company, Rockwell does a very good job, and I know others do as well. Is we're going to do the NPS data, we're going to do the customer satisfaction data, we're going to get these surveys to customers, and you sometimes have to wonder, okay, so how did my work affect that or drive that needle? And I think that's somewhere where we can get tighter, because within a UX design standpoint, we do very similar things at the product level. We're going to think about, okay, like time on task type metrics. We do Pure analysis, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pure, but pragmatic usability research by experts. If we can't get direct access to users, that's another very practical way, pragmatic way we can get a score on something there. And I think we found that stakeholders, they tend to like it because it can be very visual if you allow it to be. That's something we've done before. We've done summative scores and quantitative metrics, like kind of like a before and after. Those things tend to work well within products or a suite of products, but the way where it pushes up and gets into that customer satisfaction zone when you're kind of at that outer edge of the umbrella, that's where I think we could do more to kind of connect those things.
To connect the dots a
Yes.
little bit, yeah. But I imagine things like error rates or safety incidents or things like that are also sort of part of your measurement ecosystem. But
Sure. And if there's customer support calls that go down, that's something we want to look at too.
Yeah, you mentioned getting on those quickly and getting in the pipeline to. You mentioned Pure, so for the audience maybe that aren't familiar with Pure, just maybe say a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so basically it's intended to be not for users to kick the tires on the product. It's in the absence of being able to do that, or sometimes you just prefer to do it. It can be very effective where you have a team of designers that will go through, and this is kind of where I use the word cognitive walkthrough, that you walk through a product and you do the tasks the way a user would do them, and then you give it a score. Obviously, the harder it is, the score, you can decide how you're going to measure it, but then we'll assign, like, okay, you see this big red block there. That was very hard to do. It was easier to do. Maybe it's amber. Easiest is like a green color, and then you can see along with a numeric score how hard it was to get through it. It can be very effective from a visual standpoint, and we found that stakeholders do like that because they can easily skim the data.
It's like a visual scorecard
Yes.
for a heuristic or inspection method.
Yes, it is. And I think in the absence of actually getting customer verbatims and actual and metrics that are customer focused or user focused, that can be a very effective way to do it.
Sure. And we know a lot about heuristics for human interaction, so we need to leverage those and use those.
Yes.
And it's not a substitute for context or domain knowledge. We may have to augment those kinds of activities with more pure contextual or other kinds of research that give us more access to users. But all of it is part of delivering. So I think one of the things you mentioned that's so important is the ability to represent information visually to management so they see it. I find stakeholders like measurables, so when they see or when they see red, green, yellow, or they see, that's something they can connect with right away. So I think it is on us to help the consumers of the work that we do. It's a user-centered design process. How do we make the deliverables that we create as easy to use and as effective as possible?
I agree on that. I know it's a ham-fisted way to put it, like UX, your UX. I don't like saying that, but this is what we do. We should make sure the deliverables we have internally and the way we communicate our success or measure ourselves is, we're eating our own dog food. We're making it very usable, easy to comprehend.
Exactly. So we've talked several times in our conversation here about this idea of like getting out of our own silo, cross-silo thinking. It sounds to me like that's kind of a core value of your organization, is to like think across silos. Say a little bit more about that. How do you encourage your team to do that?
I encourage my team mainly because few are incentivized to do it. And this is no criticism of any team. Everybody has best intentions to, but at the end of the day, a lot of teams that get stood up, they're incentivized to get their specific product or solution out the door and into the customer's hands. A lot of times the date drives things, and that's a very real thing that happens all over the place. But I try, the way I sell this to my team, to think across the board outside of silos is very few teams are incentivized to do that except us. We have to make sure everything works together. Even our CEO, Blake, has said, we've got a lot of solutions. We have to make them now start to stitch together more meaningfully. That's a very public thing that we're trying to do. And I think that's one thing that we can do as a team is take that to heart and take it as a challenge. And the VP I report to, he's looking for those kind of signature wins. Where have we taken certain products that are kind of, they're sitting out there, they could be a little isolated, and helping connect those experiences. And we're trying to find the ways where it's not arbitrary, but it has meaning, and we know that a user is going to likely go from this product to using this product. And those types of workflows are happening. And I think we just have to be the accelerant to make them happen, and make them happen in a very cohesive, coherent way that is efficient, effective, and satisfying for users. It's not going to cause friction. It's going to feel like it's coming from the same company, this overall journey. And I think that, as designers, we're very passionate people. And I think that touches people from a UX standpoint. Like they want to rise to that challenge, to be able to design those systemic experiences that are going to have that type of impact. And they know that as their director, that's one thing I'm looking for. So I hope it's enough motivation if we have goals around that too, to make sure that we're going after them.
Yeah, so UX can uniquely provide connective tissue between aspects of the solution that are serving
Yes.
multiple customers. That's another unique thing I think about this work you do in the B2B space is the more complex workflow that we have to support. There's many people involved. There's state keeping. There's steps that happen in the process with time in between. And like, how do we help every user in the process understand uniquely what the status is, what they need to do to progress, through the workflow. I think that's a unique skill for B2B practitioners like yourself. So speaking of skills, you mentioned passion, which I totally agree with. This is one of the things we always talk about here. In fact, it's one of Lextant's core values is passion. And I named this podcast Seriously Curious for a reason, because the work that we do, it has to be serious. It is serious science. It seriously delivers results. But it's also about curiosity. It's about turning over rocks and being open to learning all the time from end users or from each other how to design better experiences. When you hire, like, what things are you looking for like that in candidates that make them a good fit?
Yeah, and one thing that any candidate that I interview is, first of all, I appreciate when they ask, "Hey, what are you looking for?" It's a good sign if a candidate is that curious about what their potential employer wants. And the number one thing I will answer is a curiosity, because without that, yes, you could have the best hard skills, you could have the best resume and work experience, but you have to be curious about humans. You have to be curious about the way they do things. Yeah. And also acknowledge that you are not the end user at the end of the day. You can't design solutions for yourself. Yeah. You've got to be curious about the context they find themselves in, what's important to them, and the way whatever you design will succeed or fail. And usually it will fail if you're not curious. And so I think that is something I look for. And I think also it's just communication skills. You could be the best designer, you could be the best at what you do, but if you can't articulate it, and I'm not saying everybody has to go out there and be this type A extrovert. That's not. You can be who you are, but you have to have the ability, whether it's through writing, whether it's through speaking, to articulate your design decisions and sell your stakeholders on them and get them behind you. Because that can be, honestly, that's half the battle, if not more, is to convince people to move, to act on something. Yeah. And that is a very valuable skill. And I think it all comes down to getting to that yes and getting to not saying, hey, I think you need UX research, saying, gee, are you okay with having them take 10 steps to get here? It took them 4 minutes. We could do it in 2 if we just did this. So speaking their language and speaking in terms of outcomes matters. So candidates who kind of think that way and they are able to put that across, that matters.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned specifically being able to make your arguments with empathy. Again, we talked empathy before, with empathy of who's hearing those arguments, executives who are making decisions, the ability to support your decision making. I think a big part of that support is evidence-based.
Yes.
So it's not my opinion or your opinion. It's like, okay, this is the information that we got in order to make these decisions. Because it can't be just my opinion or your opinion, so for sure. So, okay, those are great, I think, key skills. One of the things I always ask my team whenever we do a study or a program is like, okay, what did we learn? And for me, it's 2 things, like, what did we learn about humans? Because I want to, we just went and collected all this research, for example. What did we learn about people? Yeah. And then the second thing is, what did we learn about design? Like, what did we learn about the way that the things we make impacts people's experience or ability to succeed? So I think that's a great skill that, and sort of a principle, a way that at least I want my teams to always function, is always be asking the question, what did I learn? And what does it mean for the way we make things?
That's great. That's a great takeaway that I'm going to take.
Okay, great. Yeah. So John, this has been great. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks for being here and illuminating, I think, some of the unique qualities of work in business-to-business types of enterprise, massive UX, space that you're working in.
Of course.
It's super impressive work that you and the team are doing, and I think I speak for the audience too that we really appreciate your giving back insights to to the rest of us about how to do this kind of work and what's possible. I really love the kind of work that you do, and it's great to see the growth of not only your career but also the growth of your team. You mentioned 50 people now on the team. It's amazing, and you're only one team within Rockwell, so
Very true.
that's another thing for me. I think that I've seen in industrial type of industries, and it's an increasing focus on human-centeredness, which you wouldn't think this would be the place, for that. So it's great to see Rockwell Automation's investment in it. We were working with a company that was making like variable speed mowers and motors and fluids, right? And the CEO said that human-centered design is the way we'll succeed in the future. And I thought,
Great.
We're getting somewhere now.
That's music to my ears.
Yeah. When you having industrial conglomerates really committing to this kind of way of working, that means we've come far. So.
Yep.
So again, I really appreciate that, and congratulations on all the success. Tell the audience where they can find your work or how they can get a hold of you if they want to learn some more.
Yeah, probably the best way, find me on LinkedIn. You can just look up Jon Walter, Jonathan Walter. You send a message, reach out.
Okay, LinkedIn?
Probably the best way.
Okay, and then look for your articles on UX Matters.
Absolutely.
You've got one coming out this week even, it sounds like?
Yep, Monday, coming up this Monday, we're going to have one on part 2 of CX UX collaboration.
Okay, great. I'll look forward to seeing that. So.
Yeah, and I got to give a shout out to Magna, my co-author. She did a phenomenal job. She did say it was challenging to write, but it was challenging because she's forging new ground.
Yeah.
It's something where we haven't really had a playbook, is the way I think of it within Rockwell, or even other big B2B spaces, but my comment to Magda was, I think you wrote it. So check it out.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely do that. And that's another thing you mentioned earlier, which is sometimes we got to get out of our comfort zone to grow.
Yes.
And I totally agree with that. And we're doing this on this podcast for me. I never imagined a few years ago that I'd be doing a podcast. So.
Yeah, hey, likewise.
So, right.
Nice to
thanks for being
you.
here, John. It was a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks,
and
Chris.
I hope you'll come back. I think there's some discussion that we had around team leadership in general that I might like to bring some others together and talk more about that. So hopefully you'll come back and do
Sure,
that.
let's do a panel. Let's do something like that.
Okay,
For sure.
that sounds good. Thanks.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks everyone again for tuning in to Seriously Curious. Again, a podcast, all things UX for business strategy and design. I really appreciate you being here, and stay tuned for some upcoming episodes of Seriously Curious. We're going to take on brand and retail, what's next for smart mobility, and the shifting landscape of healthcare UX. So I hope you'll join us for those things. Check out Lextant.com if you want more information on how to move the needle on customer-centered design and research for your organization, and if you want access to the resources that we have here at Lextant.com. So thanks for joining us, and catch us again next time on Seriously Curious.